Chances are, you didn't play Gylt. This isn't a testament to your ability to recognize and play semi-obscure video games, nor is it indicative of the quality of the actual title. It's an educated guess based on the fact that for much of its early life, Gylt was a Google Stadia exclusive, so even if you possess the ability to recognize and play semi-obscure video games, you had to have your head in the cloud even to do so. Given that Stadia had far more pressing problems than whether its exclusives were reaching the masses, it's perfectly reasonable that a game such as Gylt, which is often described as a small-scale, self-contained horror game aimed at younger audiences, slipped under the radar. Whether those younger audiences that it might be made for were booting up their games in Google Chrome is beside the point. This leads me to advocate Gylt as less a version of survival horror for children, and more as a point of accessibility for the horror genre. Whilst this can of course apply to children, it also serves as a great starting point for those inexperienced in horror media to cut their teeth. As an entry point and a tidy, well-made experience with plenty of charm and polish, Gylt is both a Google Stadia survivor and a satisfying yet sometimes stale introduction to horror. Oh look, he said the title. It is important for me to once again pronounce that I can, in no possible definition, be described as somebody who enjoys horror media. Whilst I find it fascinating to discuss and observe from a distance through half-closed eyelids, I am far too much of a jangly-boned chicken to delve into the iconic subject matters on my own volition. I am, however, a veteran of Google Stadia, so make of that what you will. Gylt was announced with little fanfare at the Stadia Connect event, a livestream that went into detail regarding the service as well as some of the games that were coming alongside it. Gylt's announcement was primarily noted due to the developer's previous releases, having brought the world Rime, a puzzle game, and Deadlight, a side-scrolling horror platformer. It was also noted due to the fact that it was one of only a handful of unique games made for Stadia. Much of the announcements were multi-platform games that had already released elsewhere and did little to conjure excitement. And the few games that did put their chips behind Stadia were lost in the general media circus of Stadia's assured failure and the remainder of E3. Not to mention that few were really going to check out Stadia at launch anyway, making the audience for Gylt smaller than the number of crisps in the bag. It was made temporarily unavailable after Stadia was taken offline by Google, but has since been ported to PlayStation 4, 5, Xbox One, the Series consoles, Windows, and Switch. I personally played it on an Xbox Series S, which is where most of the footage you'll be seeing comes from. The developer Tequila Works received investment from Tencent in 2022, which would allow the developer in order to focus on making games rather than the continuous pursuit for funding. However, due to the current state of the video game industry, they would be unable to pay their debts and would file for insolvency. Whilst I've never played their previous works, Gylt is a game made with passion and made by talented people, and I wish its former staff the best. Gylt sets out to tell a story that explores the impact of bullying and does so fairly well. We play as Sally, a young girl who sets out to find her cousin Emily, who has recently disappeared. Whilst putting up posters to inform the town of Emily's missing status, Sally is chased by bullies and crashes her bike. Seeking an alternative way home, Sally boards a cable car which transports her to a nightmarish world, a haunted facsimile of the school that they both attend. As you chase Emily through this world, you learn that she, for some reason, holds a resentment towards Sally. Every time you get close to reuniting, Emily flees. Monsters of all shapes block your way as a result, always seeming to reflect a feeling that Emily is displaying. The various themes and twisting based on someone's psyche is very much carried by the art design. It effectively creates the uneasy environment of someone who is racked by isolation and humiliation, drawing from what I would have described as a Tim Burton-esque art style, but is more along the lines of Hello Neighbor once I put some thought into it. The constant scrolling around the environment, and extremely unsettling eyes that litter, create the perpetual feeling of surveillance, like a juvenile panopticon. The enemy design, much like a geriatric Popeye who's developed an intolerance to vegetables, isn't quite as strong. This is especially the case when it comes to the bosses, who are often amorphous coalescences of darkness, which threatens to make this a Tetsuya Nomura game. The narrative itself is delivered through a combination of cutscenes and these hand-drawn frames. The style is nice and is reflective of the remainder of the game's tone, but it is slightly jarring when the game jumps to a passage using them as they aren't seamlessly integrated into the world. It feels like the game stops you from playing it for a moment to read a storybook, one that is of a similar style, but not diegetic in the world. As the story nears its climax, it transpires that Emily's emotional state was triggered by Sally neglecting her whilst at school. Sally's friends began to make jokes at Emily's expense, though, as with many issues to plague us, it was a family member's inaction, and therefore seeming compliance with this bullying that brewed distrust, and all these negative emotions that are influencing the environment. By the close of the game, Sally is able to save Emily from a large monster, but due to a caveat which was hinted at the beginning of the game, only one of them can escape. The cable car we took to get to this place requires a ticket, of which we only have one. Here you are forced to make the only decision of the game and decide whether to give your ticket to Emily, allowing her to escape this monster-filled world, but dooming Sally to remain there to eternity, or take it for yourself and strand a young child in this world of torture. Should you free all of the other souls trapped in the nightmarish world, then you gain access to the true ending, which sees you gain a second ticket and allows both Sally and Emily to flee together. It being the only choice in the game is strange, but not necessarily a point of contention, though only one of these options really makes sense. Should you choose to lose Emily and depart yourself, the entire journey you've just been on is mute, as nothing changed and you only serve to prove Emily correct, that you don't really care about her and would prioritize your own life and well-being over hers. The other thing to note is that the game has 3 types of collectibles. Birds, which require you to shine your light on them in order to free them. Books, found in hidden places and offer insight into various emotions and happenings. And the imprisoned, the aforementioned people who were lost in the world and can be released by finding them and giving them an item. You may miss the most opportune time to get them. By the time I'd clocked where the game was going with it, there were plenty I hadn't freed. It's hinted that the imprisoned collectibles are something greater, as every time you engage with one, you receive a piece of a ticket. The other 2 types of collectible yield nothing other than what was going on, so that may tip you off that these are something special. The game also clearly signposts a point of no return, so if you are inclined to go back, there is an opportunity to do so. Gylt presents itself as a stealth game. After a short section that introduces the game's narrative and allows the player to familiarize themselves with the basic controls, we are given our first interaction with the game's most common enemy, and in no uncertain terms, are taught how to flee. Rather than immediately provide you with a method of attacking, it instead informs you of how to avoid combat, making its intentions incredibly clear. Our first interaction with one of these monsters is to follow an immediate path around it, avoiding its eyeline and escaping out the door and out of danger. Gylt stealth is, in a word, basic. In many words, it consists of everything we've come to expect from simple stealth in games. You have a crouch button, as well as a dearth of cover you can hide behind. Enemies have 3 detection phases, a neutral default one where they move along scripted paths, often turning their back to you for a stretch of time, so that you can sneak past. A second where they have noticed something awry, perhaps caught a glimpse of you, and are likely to investigate. It is this state that allows you to use distractions to your advantage, throwing soda cans across the room to lead them over, potentially providing an opening if one wasn't previously available. The final detection phase is reserved for when an enemy has spotted you, pursuing you and attacking until they lose sight, once again for a period of time. If they do spot you, there are various hiding spots such as vents that you can take shelter in, and wait out the clock until they forget about your existence. Any attack from an enemy facing away from you is an instant kill. These are the fundamentals of a stealth mechanic that we've come to expect. Titles such as Spider-Man with the Mary Jane sections, or anything Ubisoft has made in the last decade, are evident that AAA games are increasingly likely to include the illusion of avoiding detection for the sake of providing another meaningless checkbox for any given mission. Often, these rudimentary stealth systems feel lacking when compared to games that go above and beyond with them. The Hitman series is a great example of this, as it shares a lot of the aforementioned ideas, but combines it with intricate level design and opportunities so that it continues to feel fresh. Whilst Gylt stealth does follow the same hallmarks of the simple, often criticized stealth systems of games, it manages to avoid the same pitfalls, mostly as it never proclaims to be anything more. It is a straightforward game overall, and one that doesn't need a detailed or complex mechanic in order to accomplish what it sets out to do. Stealth isn't an option or a forced segment in a larger game. The stealth, while simple and not especially unique, serves to add to the atmosphere that you aren't welcome here, and it does everything it needs to do, and very little more. There is something weirdly satisfying to its simplicity, where the stealth is easily understandable and not particularly challenging, as that it wouldn't necessarily fit with the vibe it strives for. It's more a piece of an overall picture where every colour is equally weighted. For a game of this scope and design, this is enough, and is easily interpreted from the get-go. Whilst this is a positive at first, it quickly becomes a detriment when the game adds combat to the mix. The ability to fight the monsters that pursue you renders stealth a secondary option for a number of reasons. I imagine the intent was for combat to be the consequence, a last resort for if you're spotted. It's the natural progression of a stealth system to provide a method of not just fleeing when something goes wrong, but able to fight back. It's a step above the instant fail if you're spotted, but Gylt's committal to being a forgiving experience ultimately renders stealth without much of a role to play. After progressing the story to a certain point, you're given access to a more powerful flashlight. Originally used for merely illuminating the environment, Gylt proceeds to take cues from Alan Wake as the protagonist becomes the champion of light, as well as being the herald of darkness. By targeting an enemy's weak points using the concentrated beam of our torch, you can now cause enemies to dissipate, permanently ridding you of their presence. It makes the game much more fluid and dynamic as you no longer have to scurry off and wait for the AI to reset, but all sense of stealth and challenge evaporate as a result. Given that killing an enemy makes revisiting areas and backtracking significantly easier, and allows you to wander the halls at your own leisure, there is very little reason to try stealth when the combat achieves significantly improved results. If you are somebody who wants to go back and free all the people necessary for the true ending, then having stealth around every enemy would disadvantage you even more than it already does. In order to balance this ability, the game seeks to limit how much you can use this concentrated beam by giving it a power level. Using it depletes its charge, which you can refill by finding batteries across the map. An inelegant, yet effective solution that should have borrowed even more from Alan Wake and had Energizer product placement. However, Gylt is hampered once again by its desire to be a forgiving experience, as at no point are you really ever in danger of running out of power. Not only is the concentrated torch used for combat, but a trove of puzzles as well. If you happen to run out of power and resources are designed to be scarce, you may just lack the ability to continue. In order to prevent soft-locking and give you plenty of chances to recover if you fail, Gylt spreads batteries around more than the district attorney's office. They were always immediately before or after a puzzle or section with many enemies. I never felt pressed for resources, which meant carelessness with stealth was inevitable. Not only does this make the game rather easy to beat without much care, but it goes a long way to destroying the atmosphere. It's very difficult to feel hunted, to be made to feel small when all monsters are torn apart by the trusty torch and this scores never-ending supply of fresh batteries. I'm pretty sure my Xbox controller runs out of batteries more than my torch ever did, though that isn't particularly hard to beat. Even when the game introduces an enemy that can't be killed using the light, it also can't resist giving you a new tool in the fire extinguisher which can freeze the monster in place, dealing with them. It feels like the game is aware of this, as in the final gameplay section, it takes the torch and fire extinguisher away and leaves you helpless again. A great chance to reinstill its themes and ideas in its final moments. If you think that it forces you to revisit stealth as an option, think again, as running directly through the path to the next linear section loses all enemies on your tail. If you enter a cutscene or a part where the game needs to load, then the enemies that were chasing you despawn. I forgot to talk about the stamina bar. It's present. The inability to make stealth a more viable option only complicates what is truly Gylt's largest flaw as a horror game. It's not particularly scary. It is a game that is much more about the vibe of horror than it is about committing to being it. I admit that it is difficult to remain a point of accessibility whilst providing genuine fear, but even from its first moments, there is very little unease built up. I can recognize that there are elements that are supposed to be scary, but Silent Hill this is not. It is engaging with a topic that is incredibly normalized, at least it is in the English school system, and by marrying it with designs that grow tiring and familiar after a while, it never quite picks itself up. The fact that we're almost all desensitized to the effects of bullying due to its common presence in media and real life is almost enough justification as to why Gylt needs to explore it, but it does mean that it has a much more uphill battle. The harder it tries with its imagery, the more I notice how it remains the same with the entire game, and threatens to become normalized all over again. This is where a good soundtrack could elevate the experience, but after listening to it whilst playing the game and then on its own afterwards, it is an extremely forgettable accompaniment, unfortunately. Not to keep comparing it to Silent Hill, as they're ultimately different games with different scopes, but Silent Hill 2 is a great example of a game with a soundtrack that both adds to the horror atmosphere while also having a unique sound. You could probably tell by the fact that I've used mostly Silent Hill 2 music in the background of this video, rather than the Gylt soundtrack itself. Though given that both games are about a regular location and a nightmarish otherworld that is a manifestation of the protagonist's own desires, and Gylt really is just Silent Hill for children, isn't it? You might think that Gylt's biggest flaw is its lack of an ability to scare you, which would make sense given that I said that in the previous section, but it isn't necessarily true. I praised the stealth for its simplicity, and overall enjoyed Gylt's smaller scale, shorter length design, but it does struggle when it comes to shaking things up. The puzzles are often all in a similar vein, often requiring you to use your light to get rid of something or move an object so you can walk across something else. The game only really has you solve similar puzzles which aren't particularly challenging. Not that the lab puzzles in Spider-Man PS4 weren't my cup of tea, but Gylt would have served better to borrow the web slinging from it instead. There's no brain teasers here to test your puzzle skills. There are a few cases where the solution would be something that didn't occur to me, but that was mostly because it was outside of what I thought the game's logic was. It often involved throwing a can at something, either to knock something down or press a switch on the other side of something, and it feels a bit like you'd only learn these things through trial and error of your resources just because you're out of ideas. The only time the game really attempts to switch up its tactics is in the game's handful of boss encounters. Each of these is by far the most inadequate part of the game in terms of the gameplay portions. They each boil down to a gimmick. The fire boss requires cooling down using the environment, first with set streams of water, and another with timed valves you release. Both times it simply exists. The entire stealth-based one exposure is entirely boring and an exercise in waiting. The final boss is a spectacle, but extremely easy to complete, and adds very little to the climax of the story. I do think that the game would benefit from their absence, as they only serve to irritate. They're not culminations of what you've been doing for the last 5 hours, but instead require a specific way to beat them, which isn't particularly fun. Gylt is not a perfect game. I started writing this script before I'd completed it, and I was overall a lot less positive by the time the credits rolled. It's an entry-level horror experience that shares ideas and imagery with its contemporaries, but isn't quite on their levels in terms of fright. Its gameplay is simple yet satisfying, though grows old when the game doesn't have much in terms of way of development, instead adding another mechanic that functionally does something similar to the first one. Its music and boss battles are mediocre at best, but its overall narrative and visual style are interesting enough that it remains engaging until the very end. It's a mixed bag, but one I don't regret experiencing and one that was worth trying. And I would say the same about Google Stadia, to be honest. I'm glad that Gylt has earned another life on console, and I'm glad to have finally played it after years of it being on the backlog. If you have a game that you'd like me to try, please leave a comment with it. Regardless, thank you for watching, I hope you have a lovely day, and I'll see you in the front page.